Welcome to the final presentation in the 2020 University of Rhode Island Honors Colloquium entitled Challenging Expectations, Disability in the 21st Century. My name is Don DeHaze, and I have the distinct privilege of serving as Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at the University of Rhode Island. I had the honor of welcoming all of you to this series a few months ago, and tonight I'm pleased to introduce the speaker for the final presentation in this important colloquium. Tonight's presentation by ChrisTiana ObeySumner will focus on the intersection of race and disability. ChrisTiana is the CEO of Epiphanies of Equity, LLC, a social equity firm specializing in disability justice, anti-racism, and systems-level equity and justice. Epiphanies of Equity was established in 2018, providing facilitation and trainings, organizational equity scans, and strategic action equity planning for nonprofits, corporations, and government agencies. The goal of their work is to help create transformative epiphanies of equity for their clients. ChrisTiana ObeySumner has been dedicated to promoting the importance of social equity for nearly 2 decades. ChrisTiana is a skilled and renowned social equity advocate that brings contemporary analysis of social consciousness, forecasting of social trends, and lived experiences of racialized ableism and externalizing of anti-Blackness to bear on innovative approaches to equity guidance, transformative education, and thought leadership. ChrisTiana's work effectively blends identity narrative into life-changing experiences and the development of cultural humility and allyship. In addition to this important work on social equity, ChrisTiana serves as co-chair of the Seattle Disabilities Commission, is the former co-chair of the Seattle Renters Commission, and the founder of the Eleanor Elizabeth Institute for Black Empowerment. We are very fortunate to have the opportunity to hear from ChrisTiana this evening. Thank you so much, ChrisTiana, for being part of this important series and for your virtual presence with us tonight. Please welcome ChrisTiana ObeySumner. Thank you all for your participation in this critically important colloquium. Good evening.
Hello, my name is ChrisTiana ObeySumner. My pronouns are they, them. I am owner and principal consultant of Epiphanies of Equity, LLC, and this is talking about the intersection of race and disability, or racialized ableism and disability justice in the 21st century. This will be a primer for a conversation that we will have live next week, and I'm really, really looking forward to it. So let's get started. The first thing to know for some introduction and framing is this is a high-level overview, which means that there is so much information that this is just skimming the surface, so to speak. So it's important to know that there is a lot of depth, nuance, and intersections are not going to be talked about, that it's really encouraged that you prioritize your lifelong learning, a commitment, and begin to use this work. It's also important to know this is a historical and continuous context, which means there has been schools of thought and narratives and voices and leadership amplified historically, and they will continue to be. It is important to hold this information as sort of a checkpoint for where we are, or perhaps where we may have recently been, and be fluid and adaptive to what is coming up soon. It's also important not to assume homogeneity of this. What that means is that it's not one size fits all. There's no sort of universal truth, so to say, but there are some guiding principles that can be interpreted and lived differently than everyone else, even if you share intersections or identity. So it's really, really important to consider all the different sort of ways that this may apply to you and to build your toolkit in that way. The goal in this training and with all the work that I do is to work towards adaptive intuition, not reactive performance, or the ability to disrupt and solve issues working backwards. Another way to think about this is how do we change how do we transition knowledge into wisdom? Well, the term reasoning backwards comes from one of my favorite books, which is Sherlock Holmes. And in the beginning of the book, Watson asked Sherlock how he's able to solve the mysteries. And Sherlock says, in response to that, most people, if you describe a train of events to them, will tell you what the result would be. They can put those events together in their minds and argue from them that something will come to pass. There are few people, however, who, if you told them a result, would be able to evolve from their own inner consciousness what the steps were which led up to that result. And this is the power what I mean. This power is what I mean when I talk of reasoning backward. When we think about results, we should think about think of it as outputs or outcomes of the actions and behaviors of people. I always say that the biggest confounding variable to any equity initiative is people. So a lot of times when we talk about equity work and how do we achieve a goal of equity, we think about systems and policies and institutions, discrimination, bias, imperialism, capitalism, oppressive politics. It all goes on. And we also think about the ways in which these topics, these impacts, many of which violent, harmful, oppressive, marginalizing, exploitative, or to be even more dire, genocidal. That they have been ignored, or they have been minimized, or they have not really taken hold, and that is also the result of the actions and behaviors, the status quo, the expectations, the assumptions, the biases of people. It's important that we see that the equity work and that the products or the results of people also have its own origin story, its impetus. So how can we reason backward with in a sort of adaptive, fluid, intuitive, proactive way when we are faced with the results of a person or a sociology of people, a group of people from yesterday, this year, last decade, last century, since 1964's civil rights movement, or some of the dates that we'll talk about here, in terms of disability rights and justice. I'm also here to tell you, I have really, really tried to see if it's possible to hold all of that in sort of a categorical way, so that when, that you can have all the time and the tools and frameworks and the concepts for when a moment comes and you see an implicit bias and this is what you do. But unfortunately, I do think that this is impossible. I think that the goal should not be an intention that when you are done with this training, that you will have a laundry list of when you face XYZ scenario, you'll do ABC thing. The goal should be to develop the foundations, tools, and frameworks so at any time and any moment, you'll be able to find the most applicable and strategic solution by reasoning backward. On this slide, there are two images. One is three triangles, and the first one says information, and there's different dots scattered all over the place. Second says knowledge, and those dots have lines connecting them. Then the third has wisdom, where there's only two dots. And so it's taking all of the information, it is connecting it through knowledge building, and wisdom is being able to have that sort of proactive, adaptive intuition to know these are the pieces that we need to really focus on. The second photo has a quote from William Cowper that says, knowledge is proud that it has gender terminology, so I will change it to say they. Knowledge is proud that they have learned so much. Wisdom is humble that they know not more. So before we could talk about disability justice, and especially how the intersection of race and disability come together, we first have to establish a difference between disability rights and disability justice, because they're not the same. Disability rights has happened for a long time. This combating ableism has happened for a long time. But disability rights in particular was a movement to establish the civil rights of people with disabilities or disabled people. I'm going to pause here to state that you will hear me use those terms interchangeably. And the difference between saying people with disabilities and disabled people is a difference between person first, people with disabilities, and identity first, disabled person, language. Depending on who you speak to, depending on what their disability or impairment is, and how they regard that in their lived experience as an inextricable part of their identity, or sort of something that is part and parcel of their overall constellation of their lived experience, people will likely have a preference. It is important, similar to pronouns, to ask people how they identify if you're in a space with disabled folks or people with disabilities. Often, it is safe to say that autistic folks and folks who are deaf, hard of hearing, um, will almost always use identity first language. They are a deaf person and not a person with deafness. They're an autistic person and not a person with autism. There are some other folks or people who are blind or low vision. So they're a blind person and not a person with blindness, right? But there are some folks who will likely use more person first language. So they may be a person with a person experiencing depression or living with depression or not a depressed person, although they may say that. So it is important to talk to people. So now I'm going over. Just so you know how I see these things. This was established for civil rights of people with disabilities or disabled people. And the reason why is because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not include a lot of communities, but disabled folks was definitely one of them. And there was still a lot of systemic ableism and paternalism around that ableism that created not just glass ceilings, but glass floors, glass walls, glass rooms. And so it was a long, hard fight. I think that one of the best portrayals of that fight is either Being Human, the Judy Heumann story, human being spelled Heumann, and or Crip Camp, which Judy Heumann is featured in, that talks about the process from the 60s through 1990s and beyond of what it took to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, for equal rights protections. It is also great opportunity to read those things, as those pieces do have some nuances in them that the disability community and others and their supporters and people in solidarity have some constructive criticism around that we'll talk a little bit about with disability justice. It is an equality model similar to the Civil Rights Act. It's an equality model, and so what that means is they're looking to say you have a right to equal access and protection under this, but there may not necessarily be the foundations and structures, especially in a socio-cultural or political sense, to actually support that or to ensure that everyone has equal access, given the different sort of intersectional lived experiences in addition to being disabled that may happen. So for example, if you have a right based on the ADA to go to the park and to have that park be accessible as a wheelchair user, there is not necessarily anything in that policy that says if you are a wheelchair user going to the park who say is a Black person of size, and someone comes up to you and assumes that you say are a person experiencing homelessness and tries to call the police on you loitering, that is not, there's not really a catchment for that. And so since there are experiences like this and they're not uncommon, the disability rights movement, while it has had a nod or a conversation about some intersectional analysis, it is still very much lacking intersectional analysis. And legal and rights-based frameworks are really difficult to bring in sort of liberatory frameworks or equity-based frameworks, because it is focusing on what can be done within the confines of policy and law and precedent. On this slide, there is a picture of people holding a sign that says disability rights are human rights on what looks like a hallway in an older building, perhaps Congress. and one person in the middle is holding a a gray cardboard sign that says guilty on it, and there is a looks like a jail door with some blonde hair sticking out the top of some bars. Disability justice is a liberatory framework that came in the early 2000s by a group of Black and Brown queer disabled activists in the Bay Area. And it lives under the home of Sins Invalid, which is an organization, a national organization that focuses on access and disability justice, particularly within theater and the arts. This liberatory framework was created specifically to address some of the areas that disability rights were not addressing, and that was causing gaps in access, in equity, in justice for people at the intersections of disability and. It is meant to be intentionally fluid and dynamic. It is based on 10 principles for transformative change. It's to explain the difference between transformative and transactional change. Transactional change are sort of single barrier issues or things to be addressed within a certain framework or policy that can help a group of people or can address perhaps a pain point in a more direct or shorter term way. It usually is based on a policy or a misunderstanding or sort of a bottleneck in process. So an example that I see in my work as a consultant is, well, I have nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with the PTO policy itself. It's just I don't know how to access the work day or the system that is needed to ask for my PTO. I don't understand my PTO. I think that I need to have this be a little bit clearer. That's a transactional change. That is, as you know, that is creating a accessibility policy that is changing the platform that is used. It is something that's a transactional change. Transformative change is addressing a root cause, not the effect of a root cause. It is addressing the fire, not the smoke of the fire. It is changing the systems, and it's usually something that's a culture shift, paradigm shift. This example would be, I don't think that we have the sort of organizational culture where I feel safe or encouraged to take PTO. That would be a transformative change. And so disability justice is seeking transformative changes based on these 10 principles. Loosely, a good way of thinking about this is disability justice is to disability rights as the Black Lives Matter movement is to the civil rights movement. It is essentially saying there is a policy or there has been this movement that we are now saying that was great, that was needed in its time, but there are some pieces that we really need to address to achieve equity before we can focus on whether we're achieving equality. The 10 principles of disability justice, as I'll go through them, the first one is intersectionality. In this case, intersectionality, there are two concepts that I'll talk about. There is the original intention and context, and there's sort of the more contemporary context. And this is a very contentious topic in equity space. The original context was that the term was coined by a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw was a Black woman who was receiving reports from other Black women, cis Black women in this case, who felt as though they were not being considered for work in an automobile manufacturing company. When she went to go investigate that, it was found that the company was very defensive. They were like, oh, no, because this was in the 80s. They're like, oh, no. We hire Black folks and we hire women. So I don't know what may be going on. It must be something going on with this group of people. After Kimberly Crenshaw's audit, she found that they were hiring Black folks, but they were primarily hiring Black folks in back of house manufacturing line work sort of jobs. So the Black women in this case was experiencing sexism or misogyny based on an expectation that while Black folks can work there, they'd be primarily Black cis men working on the line. And they did hire women, but they primarily hired white women for administrative front of house work. So they in their case, the Black women were experiencing racism or anti-Blackness, because while they were hiring women for this front of house administrative work, they were not hiring Black women. So they were experiencing an intersectional compounded effect that the term now is called misogynoir. So NOIR is the end of misogyny to mean a misogyny that is coupled with anti-Blackness. And so in this case, intersectionality is holding back the compounded, the original intent of two or more identities in one's intersectionality that are historically or systemically oppressed, marginalized, or exploited. The more contemporary context that has kind of taken this by storm is two or more identities that make up your lived experience, whether they be historically or systemically exploited, marginalized, or oppressed, or they may be privileged or majoritarian. And in the disability justice principles, the intersectionality point is definitely on the case of Kimberly Crenshaw. And this is important because the second point is leadership of those most impacted. So in order to know who's most impacted, you also have to understand intersectionality. And when we say most impacted, we're saying people who have two or more, likely on the more side, of those identities in our intersections that are historically or systemically oppressed, marginalized, or exploited. And having leadership of folks who are most impacted, beyond amplifying the voices, but amplifying the leadership of those most impacted, provides the nuanced understanding of that is embodied in this lived experience. So when we're talking about at the intersection of race and disability, for example, this will require to not only understand the intersectional impact of racism or anti-Blackness and disability or racialized ableism, it would also require you to have in leadership folks who were at minimum Black and disabled, and if possible, Black and disabled, marginalized gender, LGBTQIA plus, English as a second language, undocumented, underdocumented, DACA student, all as many of those experiences as possible, or as many of those experiences as possible in the room, because it will give the greatest finger on the pulse and the most nuanced analysis because they've lived it. They're not having discourse, they're not assuming. And an anti-capitalist politic. People get stuck on this, but essentially what it means is a combination of labor justice, economic justice. It essentially is meaning that we are not going to move with the capitalist mindset where people's worth is based on their productivity and their labor. That there are people who own the means of production, and there are people who are used in order to fulfill the means of that production based on a ableist idea of productivity and labor. And so a piece of this that's really important too, as a case study or as an anecdote, is I have here in Seattle, I was the co-chair of the Seattle Disabilities Commission, and I was happy to collaborate on having sub-minimum wage banned in the city and in the county. King County is where Seattle is. The Fair Standards in Labor Act allow organizations to apply for specific certificates that, among other things, can also allow them to pay disabled people a sub-minimum wage in what they call a sheltered workshop. A sheltered workshop is a space where people are saying, well, we are providing vocational training or opportunities for disabled folks in sort of a controlled environment. And subminimum wage means just that, that you are able to pay folks a wage that is lower than the required minimum wage. And it's often based on this idea that the productivity or the labor of the disabled person is not worth the investment up to a minimum wage, and that allowing some minimum wage allows certain disabled folks, especially those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as mobility impairments, to work with their organization. One of the most infamous of this is Goodwill, where they have been found to be paying disabled folks as little as a couple of cents on the dollar per hour. So none of that. And the difficulty with this is that at the state level here in Washington, the measure to ban some minimum wage did not pass because there was some concerns about the capitalistic understandings of it. Well, if we have to pay everyone minimum wage, then perhaps we won't hire as many disabled people because it's not going to work out for us in terms of the return on investment and the productivity and the labor. So it's not about creating an environment where people can exist and thrive. It's about what's my bottom line here. Commitment to cross-movement organizing is pretty self-explanatory, and it's also really important in terms of the conversation today with like race and disability. So you may have seen over the summer with the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests, a Black Disabled Lives Matter sort of parallel movement trying to infuse itself into the Black Lives Matter movement, trying to talk about the prioritization of care with COVID-19 and the disproportionate impact on disabled folks and Black, Indigenous people of color. And it's important. And part of disability justice is essentially none of us are free until all of us are free, which is also the 10th point. Recognizing wholeness is essentially saying that we don't see any body mind as broken. It's important to hold that everyone is whole just as they are. Sustainability means that any work that is done, if it's not sustainable, it's not doing it. And so all of the work needs to be sustainable for everyone at every level of accessibility and need, or as many as possible. Commitment to cross-disability solidarity is essentially a way of saying that we also need to come together in this. And again, none of us are free until all of us are free. If you are disabled, or if you've organized in the disabled community or disability community, you may have seen that there are some tete-a-tete conversations that have happened based on the lived experiences of disability. And so some folks may feel that their experience of disability needs to be prioritized or has been chronically minimized, and it becomes a whole situation. So this is saying it's important to have that cross disability solidarity. Interdependence essentially means that it is the antithesis of the sort of individualistic mindset that we have in our society. It essentially means that we live in society with each other, and we're all roommates in this earth project. We really need to understand our impact on others. And this is also sort of where collective mutual aid lives in terms of disability justice organizations, that we also need to pool together to survive together. And that in an interdependent sort of collective mutual aid, collective sort of space, that we can do that for us, by us. Collective access means that everything that is done, including materials, needs to be accessible for the collective. And again, collective liberation, none of us are free until all of us are free. On this slide, there is a picture of a brown woman with reddish brown hair sitting in a jazzy electric wheelchair / scooter. It has a basket on the front, and they're wearing a yellow top that's a crop top with black leggings and red strappy high heel sandals. On the top, it says disability is an intersection, and this person has their fist in the air. So let's talk about the difference between knowledge and wisdom. In this case, of disability rights. So, the knowledge of disability rights, it's policy change, and there's a policy change that was needed. But it begs the question of who has access to be able to make those sort of policy changes, given what we know about the other sort of systemic issues, not just ableism and what people with disabilities or disabled people face, but also, the racism, anti-Blackness, transmisogyny, homophobia, xenophobia, nationalism, like all of these different sorts of things. It's important to think about who has access to the systems for policy change. The same with litigation, not only who has access, but who has resources. A lot of the disability rights movement was predicated on precedent and case law. So people would be able, up until the 77, where they had this large occupation in the Bay Area for over a month, that led to the passage of Section 504, which was a precursor to the ADA. But even 1990, where there's the sort of dramatic scene of being asked to give testimony in Congress, but they're not being in an accessible way. So disabled folks crawled up the stairs with their caregivers. So what led up to all of that was, people, they're not allowing me to go to school. They're not allowing me to apply for this job. They're not giving me the accommodations I need to get into a home. I mean, there was these heartbreaking stories of people who would go to school to be, like, say, a teacher. They would get a degree and they would do their training and they would get hired for a job, and you'd show up to the school and they're, say, a wheelchair user, and the school only has steps and there's no way into the building, and the superintendent comes out on the stoop and they say, "I'm so sorry," and then they walk away and you lost your job, and there wasn't any protections for that. And so that person would go to court and litigate, and they would create this case law that led to the ADA. It's just that needed to have resources. So you have to think then what voices led to the formation of this disability rights. The ADA applications are important, and it creates those foundational needs that we have now, but it doesn't necessarily cover equity issues, and it doesn't cover what happens when ableism still is insidious within ADA applications. One of the terms that I created around this in particular is hostile accommodations. So the ADA says that essentially you have to provide accommodations within a reasonable amount, as well, with a understanding that there's a disability to be accommodated. And so people will get into this space where they're like, okay, you need an accommodation, but then they will make the process for attaining that accommodation either so lengthy or Herculean or labyrinthine, like it's complicated, that people either can never reach the point where they would be able to get accommodations because of all of the rigmarole and the red tape and the bureaucracy, or they would become frustrated by the end of it and they would give up. That is something I see a lot in my work. It is something that does not necessarily have a way to address it in the ADA, as long as they can show a good faith effort to provide an accommodation, which is where the equity issue comes in. And it's also, like I was saying earlier, beginning the conversation with who's centered in that discussion. Whereas with disability justice, with some of these questions and concerns, that's where this wisdom comes in, especially when you have that leadership of most impacted. You start to not only disrupt systems, but by folks bringing that intersectional mindset and these 10 principles, you can start to infuse the systems with it, that it can then lead to a disability platform of liberation and justice that is intersectional, interdependent, that has both cross movement and cross disability solidarity, so that everyone can eat in this case, and that there's collective access and liberation and sustainability. Racialized ableism is at the intersection, is the compounded harm, violence, and bias at the intersection of racism or anti-Blackness or anti-Indigeneity or nationalism, xenophobia, and ableism. It's also important, like I said, or as Audre Lorde says, we are not single issue beings and we don't live single issue lives. So other intersections definitely can and do play a part here as well. Those are gender, size, color, skin color or tone, and class. And those often do play a part as well in racialized ableism. The picture you see is of a Black man with kinky, coily black hair of medium length with black glasses, a green uh, uh, camouflage fatigue style t-shirt with some black beads, holding a wooden walking stick in what looks like a forest with some changing leaves behind him. And this person is Matthew Rushin. Matthew Rushin is a person who became very well known over the summer as part of the Black Disabled Lives Matter movement. It is a good story to share about how racialized ableism can play in the 21st century, especially given the conversations we've had. Matthew is autistic, among other things. And the reason why the autism piece is important is because autistic folks, and there's some studies around this, this will come up, but there's some research and studies around how autistic folks have more instances of automobile accidents and malfunctions based on their executive functioning and some sort of heightened other issues, such as there is this tendency, I should know the term for it. I will also send the article, an article talking a little bit more about the wonkiness of this if you're interested. But there is a term that talks about how people will have this tendency to put their foot on the gas at a pressure that they did not intend, but they did not necessarily feel that they applied more pressure than they intended. And that it's one of the number one reasons for fender benders. It's something that everyone does, but folks, disabled, autistic folks have a higher tendency of doing this. This is important because Matthew was driving a car. He was in a parking lot. In this parking lot, this happened where he applied his brakes, applied his gas. He hit another car. Some people were hurt. In the short amount of time when he hit the car, according to Matthew, he hit the car. He realized in sort of a delayed reaction time what had happened. He was working to turn the car around when police came onto the scene, and things kind of went south from there. On the outside, the report was that the basic report was that he was doing a hit and run and that it was intentional for him to do this. It turned out that when he was arrested, and there's a larger conversation about the criminal justice system and the guilty plea mill of this, but essentially what will happen is that in most criminal justice cases, there's this tendency to ask people to take a guilty plea and then you'll get like a plea bargain. The difficulty with a guilty plea is that they're usually asking you to agree to things that aren't actually what happened. And in this case, that happened to Matthew, where they said, hey, if you say that you did this on purpose and it was because you were suicidal and you were trying to follow through on suicidal intent, then we can, and that you're guilty of this, then we can give you this deal. And so that's what he did. And then he was sentenced to a large amount of jail time. It became very evident as he was calling home that he didn't understand what this meant. He was doing things like calling his mom and asking for her to bring snacks for his new friends in prison. It was very obvious he didn't know what was going on and that this was not true. Over the summer, there was a large outcry to review this case, which they were very resistant to at first. But then there was a person who, a team of people who did some research that led to that one finding about the executive functioning in autistic folks driving, and was able to free Matthew. Another person to talk about is Elijah McClain. Was another person. Elijah McClain, was someone who's very quiet. His family said that he was neurodivergent, and that he was someone who frequently went out to volunteer. One day he went out listening to music, and he was sort of moving along with the music, depending on who you talk to in the disability community. Some people were like, he's autistic and he was stimming. Some people were just like, he was just feeling himself. But he had his headphones on and he was moving, and I guess police approached him. He didn't respond because the headphones were on. They saw that he was moving. They thought that he was a danger. They shot him, or they didn't shoot him. They tackled him, they held him down, and then they used ketamine to subdue him, which then led to it interacting with some other impairments and chronic health issues, and he had a heart attack and he died. The difficulty with this, and this is policing, but the difficulty with this is these stories are the most popular, but they're not uncommon. Racialized ableism is seen in housing, is seen in employment, it is seen in the medical system, it is seen through the social determinants of health, it is seen in environmental racism. An example of environmental racism, especially thinking about COVID-19 and why Black and Brown people are so disproportionately impacted. There is a neighborhood in Brooklyn, I believe it's in Brooklyn, called Asthma Alley. Before COVID-19, it had 21 times the hospitalizations of any other borough and 7 times the national hospitalization for asthma. The reason why there was such a disproportionate number of people in Asthma Alley that has asthma is because they're in what they call a sacrifice zone. So with environmental inequity, especially environmental racism, what a sacrifice zone is let's say you're putting up a highway, you're putting up a manufacturing plant, something that's going to have a economic environmental impact, either because of exhaust, because of leaching, because of runoff, because of pollution. And so when you place this in a space, the powers that be, whether it's the city planner or developer, says, okay, well, this is going to happen, this runoff, this exhaust, it has to go somewhere. So how can we sort of use the nature of the trade winds or the elevation of and sloping of the ground, if it's leaching or runoff, it to have a pathway for this to go. Very many times that pathway is near, in, through, or over a community that is largely Black or Brown. More so than folks who are poor, but that is also a category, and especially those who are Black and Brown and under-resourced or poor. Asthma Alley is one of those places, and so people are born with asthma. It's similar to like with Flint, Michigan. We now have a generation of people who are born with lead poisoning and the implications and disabilities and impairments that come with that. So you think about these sort of pieces, and then you think about our society and our culture's reactions to them. We want to talk about things like these social determinants of health. Black, it's not so much that Black folks or Black Indigenous people of color, under-resourced Black Indigenous people of color are in these areas of food deserts or food apartheids. But maybe if they ate better than that, maybe if they ate less sweets, maybe if they changed their diet, then they wouldn't have such high levels of diabetes. We have these statistics that Black and Brown folks are more likely to die in the ER of a heart attack or some other sort of heart emergency than white folks. But if Black folks would just take more care of their heart health, and they would exercise more or something like that, then maybe they wouldn't die so much of hypertension or heart attack. We have these metrics that Black birthing people are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during the act of childbirth when they were receiving the prenatal care, or if they're receiving a postpartum care than white folks. But then, of course, if Black folks just took care of their health, and like, why there's such a high level of fibroids, and maybe there needs to just be more of these things. So we have this dual and dissonant consciousness about racialized ableism in particular, not just racialized ableism in folks who are diagnosed and disabled, because that is a population, but that is perhaps not even a majority of the population. We have to think about access to healthcare, and even if you have access to healthcare, access to payment and insurance for that healthcare, and even if you have payment insurance for that healthcare, the impacts of the sort of insurance and healthcare that you have when you enter into a medical environment, and even if you have that, access to the actual diagnoses and treatments that are happening within your body, and that's not is based on a bias and expectation of a Black person. Personal story is that I was once hit in a crossroad by a 6-wheel truck making a left-hand turn in a well-lit area while I was in the crosswalk. I got hit. There was a witness. I was on the ground. They called 911. The paramedics came, sort of laying there. They take my vitals while I'm still on the ground. The paramedic says, "Do you happen to have hypertension? Because your blood pressure and heart rate is really high. And I know that Black folks have a tendency to have hypertension." What was really upsetting about that moment is that I was literally in the street after getting hit by a 6-wheel truck. And in that moment, instead of saying, "Oh, this person has a high heart rate and high blood pressure because they just got hit by a 6-wheel truck and are still on the road," it went directly to, "Oh, you're Black, so this must be a Black person thing," right? And even if that's not what they said explicitly, it's important to have an impact over intent as opposed to an intent versus impact mentality. As the old adage says, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so it's not necessarily important. It is important to be aware of your intention for your own intrapersonal development. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can use it as a piece of reflection. But in terms of the equitable outcomes that we talked about, your results in a Sherlock sort of example is negative, it's inequitable, it's harmful. And so in that, it is more important to hold the impact of those actions and behaviors than to have the sort of right to comfort with your intent, which I encourage you to look up the 13 Principles of White Supremacy Culture by Tema Olkin, Temaokun, where right to comfort is the 13th of the 13 principles. So what can you do? I mean, we talked a lot about some kind of heavy stuff, and so it's important to talk about what you can do next. Well, what you can do in this moment is, if this is not some, as you're in this class or you continue on this journey to become familiar with emerging frameworks and movements, both disability justice, but also within disability justice. Community mutual aid, which came out of disability justice, transformative justice, which came out of disability justice. Everything we're doing right now in terms of the virtual environment and how to work from home and organize and communicate in a virtual environment came out of the disability community and also out of disability justice. So there are also frameworks and movements within this movement that I really highly encourage you to take part in. Advocate for transformative change in your work in your community, and to bias and develop your praxis. Praxis, as you see on the, or you may see on the right hand of the screen, is a sort of circular process of actions at the corners, and in this case, bottlenecks or barriers that I've seen in the streets. The 3 actions at the top is theory or knowledge building, which you're doing right now. The second is the theory. You take what you learn in theory and you put it into practice, and then you take what you've put into practice and you reflect on that, and then you go back to theory. And it's all sort of around sort of this lifelong praxis of learning and development and cultural humility and intellectual humility. Cultural and intellectual humility essentially saying, I probably just don't get it. I don't get it perhaps about this culture. I will never be competent in this culture. So cultural humility is sort of the answer to sort of naysaying cultural competency, that you'll never be competent in a culture, even your own. And intellectual humility is just that you don't know everything. You might not get it because you just don't know everything. To talk about some of the barriers and bottlenecks, the bottleneck that I see between building theory and putting it into practice is risk. So people have a fear of risk. They're afraid, okay, I learned this thing, but I put it into practice. What if it doesn't go right? What if, someone gets upset? Am I even supposed to do this? Do I know enough? Do I have what I need to put this into practice? And my thing is just do the thing. Take the risk, put it into practice, because the biggest issue I've seen with equity work is that this is a non-starter. People will learn and learn and learn. They'll take the workshops and the classes, and they'll read the books and they'll do the things, but then they don't actually practice it in its fullness because of fear of risk. But let's say you do put into practice, and the next bottleneck that I see is that people have this tendency to get stuck at learning from both their mistakes and their successes. That's because when there's a mistake, there's this tendency to be like, oh, I knew it wasn't going to go right. This was a mistake. I'm just going to, I'm just not going to do that again, or I'm going to come back to it when I need to, or I'm sort of demoralized at this point. And if there's a success, you're like, oh, I got it. See, I knew it. I'm good. I'm good. I don't have anything else to learn. It's great. I encourage you that regardless of what happens, to always reflect on it, to make it a goal to find a level of reflection that works for you, that you can do often, if not daily. If that's not writing in a journal, having that as part of your meditative practice, having it be sort of the intention that you start off with your day of reflecting on of yesterday while you're brushing your teeth or eating your breakfast or walking your dog or whatever that may be. And the barrier that I see from reflection to theory is both filling in gaps and strategizing. What I mean is that let's say you take the theory, you put it into practice, you take that risk, from the practice, you take the time to learn from your mistakes and success and reflection. And once you're in that state of reflection, you either have to fill in gaps and say, this is where my growth areas are. This is where the pain points are. I need to go and fill in those gaps with more learning or knowledge building, or sort of learning at the feet of people who are in this community. Or in this experience, or you have to re-strategize. The biggest difficulty with re-strategizing is usually for folks who've done this for a long time, or kind of are set in their ways, or they otherwise just feel like re-strategizing would be, they see it more as a step backward than a step forward. And I do really, really encourage you to do both. What you can do today. As I said, culture of humility, part of that is self-evaluation critique. So what are those areas that you have perhaps not paid as much development attention to, or reflection attention to, or practice attention to, because you're like, I got it, I'm competent, I'm good, I'm an expert on this. And take some time for some self-evaluation critique and kind of think like, are you good? Is there not more that you can learn? And practice that, even for those communities that you're a part of. Talk to a trusted friend or peer about what you may be digesting today, and research some topics or vocabulary that you're still grappling with. On the right hand, there is a picture of Garnet from Steven Universe, and it says, feeling uncomfortable is a necessary part of unlearning oppressive behaviors. What can you do along your journey? Do the thing. So I always have to do the thing, and it's in all caps with the exclamation point, because as I said, fear of risk in doing the thing is the biggest bottleneck that I see to any equity initiative moving forward, or any liberatory framework being effective. So do it. Do the thing. Seek to disrupt systems and organize yourself, or create a personal equity strategy. So that's like you would organize a community initiative or a project or a group. Organize yourself. What are your strengths? Who do you rely on? What are your resources? What is your bandwidth? What's your timeline? Do you have anyone that you are in solidarity with? partnership with. Sit down and think about these things, and it may help you to have more sort of clarity on where you've been, where you are, where you want to go, and if you're on the right track of getting there. Unless I have the screen, there's a salmon sort of background with two lighter skin toned hands in a green circle in their hands that says inside of it, you don't need to be a voice for the voiceless, you just have to pass the mic, and it's credited to Suad Abdul Kabir. You may have heard the term allies and accomplices. Well, in this case, it's important. I'm going to talk about the sort of delineation between the two. This is a terminology that that has been shared a lot, but it has came out of a post or decolonial Indigenous liberatory framework. An ally is often a person who advocates for equity, either interpersonally or within certain systems or structures. If you know the difference between restorative and transformative justice, it's kind of like a restorative justice. So this is like, we need to address perhaps, I have seen inequity or discrimination for people, for Black, Indigenous people of color who are disabled. So we should make sure that we change our organization so that there is a sense of belongingness here for people who may come through who are Black, Indigenous people of color who are disabled. And it's important to do that. It's very, very important for a very different reason. This is more, we talked about transactional and transformative change. This is transactional change. An accomplice is someone who is advocating for equity through disrupting the institutional or systemic harm, likely on a much broader, longer term, deep-rooted scale. And so this is more that transformative justice. This is that transformative change. So both are important for different reasons. It's not saying that one is better than the other, but if we had to talk about what is the goal would be to be in solidarity. And what it means to be in solidarity as opposed to being an ally or an accomplice means that you are doing what it takes to amplify the voices and leadership of those most impacted, to learn from those communities, and to follow the calls to action that are coming out of those communities in a way that is also holding a critical consciousness, which means having an understanding and awareness and groundedness in self, as well as the impact that you have when you enter into these organizing homes, or the way that my spouse puts it, the things that walk in the room before you do. So let's say if you are, say, a person with a lived experience with a lot of sort of privileged identities, say, like, let's just say all the privileged identities, right? You're white, cis, heterosexual, sexual, man, that is non-disabled and able-bodied, that was born in the United States, and English is your first language, and you are within a body type and size that isn't considered to be overweight or obese or otherwise would elicit fat phobia, like all of these different sort of things, right? Acknowledge that if you're walking into a space with Black, Indigenous people of color who are disabled and marginalized gender, LGBTQIA+, and ESL, and underdocumented, or all these different sort of things, what the impact that you may have on that space, and then to move in solidarity with that community, understanding and having awareness and groundedness of your impact in that space if you are invited into that space, and always ensure that you're invited into that space. Do not be a Goldilocks ally where you're kind of just coming in and saying, this is sort of where I'm at now. Make sure that is a explicit invitation. The holistic and equity social justice framework is something that was that came out of a phrase my mom used to always tell me growing up, that there are ways that people are and there's things that people do, and the ways that people are is not always reflected in the things that they do, and the things that people do is not always a good reflection of who they are, but that the goal of this life is to find sort of a synergy in that. And so I thought about, a way to sort of fractal your impact out. If you haven't read it, fractaling out your impact is a term that comes from Adrienne Marie Brown's book Emergent Strategy, where it's sort of like thinking about the ripples in a pond. And so in fractaling out your impact, you start from internally in the individual of who you are. You start to have that critical consciousness that we just talked about. You start to work on the integrity, or in this case, I'm defining integrity as in finding and holding synergy and harmony between who you say you are and what morals and values that you hold and what it is you do and the impact that you have in space. Working on social reconstruction of your understanding of the world, as well as working through debiasing, and cultural and intellectual humility. And as you start to infuse that and other sort of principles and standards into who you are, then it'll also come out into what you do. So if you do commit, or you are the perpetrator of harm, that you would be able to take responsibility for that harm and not sort of be defensive in that you're able to hold regret and remorse as opposed to apathy. You're able to resolve the issue as opposed to sort of looking to absolve yourself of blame, and that you're open to repair or reparation as opposed to perhaps like punitive or perhaps sort of like a we're good sort of situation. And as you do that as an individual, it will have an impact on what you do as a student, as an employee, as a member of the community. You'll start to do things with more collective impact because it'll be part of who you are and part of what you do on the daily, on the regular. They'll start to have more of that systems thinking, that sort of eagle-eye view where you're kind of seeing seeing the forest for the trees. That reasoning back where we talked about in transformative justice. And it will also lead to the places, especially if everyone is doing it. So first of all, everyone has to be doing it, but if everyone is doing it, then, and you have a organization or institution that is made up of sociology of people, individual actors that are working on having a holistic equity and social justice framework as part of the way that they move in the world, then it can lead to that sociology being more proactively equitable, collective, innovative, fluid, adaptive, and dedicated to lifelong continuous improvement. Weathering is a term to talk about. It's a term that I borrowed from geology. I thought I was going to be a geologist, and I was like, I'm not climbing a mountain for core samples. But one of the things I really loved was minerals. And so in geology, what you see here is a photo, and at the top, there's a bunch of rocks with rain droplets on it. And then on the bottom is a rock with a lot of different sort of pits and holes in it. And this, in the geological sense, is a product of weathering, which is sort of when you have the drip, drip, drip of say, like of rain or waterfall or something like that on a rock, that water starts to demineralize or take away sort of the solidness of the rock, right? And so if you think about the drip drip as Eurocentric or oppressive, marginalizing, exploitative assumptions, biases, policies, systems, programs, having to code switch, having to mask, having to perform sort of Eurocentric ideals of things like professionalism and beauty and all these different sorts of things, right? Then it can lead to this sort of pitting, if you think about this in terms of someone's soul, in terms of someone's nerves, in terms of someone's cognitive load. The effect of this is sort of long-term anger and anxiety responses in a larger, broader sense of our fight, flight, and freeze response. It can lead to distraction and disruption in a person's development, especially if they're younger, or professional development in their career, because they are so focused on sort of surviving that they are not really focused on anything else. And then it can lead to these sort of long-term micro traumas. And when I say micro traumas, what I'm saying is that they're not to the level of, say, like a post-traumatic stress disorder, but they are something that has a long-term effect that sort of is those little inklings that you get in your body where it makes your somatics not feel very happy. So an example of like a micro trauma, say you have one organization you work for and you experience a lot of, say, anti-Black racialized ableism from a person who is, say, that archetype of that super privileged identity that we had, the white cishet man, right? Well, then you see another person who favors the appearance of this white cishet man, perhaps the same haircut, the same conversational style, the same accents, things like that, that then it starts to elicit a fight, flight, or freeze response in a way that may not be hyper visible or hyper vigilant, but it is enough that it can cause some disruption, especially lack of rapport building and all different sort of stuff. So it's important to think about. It's also important to think about the 4 different sort of areas of social change. I have, individual, that's your feelings and beliefs of what's sort of happening in your lived experience of being in your body. Interpersonal, which is the actions, behaviors, and language that you that comes out of your body with another person or group of people or into that sort of social space or interpersonal space. There's the institutional pieces, which are all the containers, the areas, the pieces that we have, our legal systems or educational systems or public schools or hiring practices or media images, the places we work, policies and things like that. And the societal would be the collective ideas are almost right, or like those social constructs. And equity and social justice should be the outcome and litmus in the societal piece, which means your impact should not just fractal from yourself, from your internal self, from your intrapersonal self, but it should impact from yourself to the interpersonal, from the interpersonal to the institutional, from the institutional to the societal. By the time it hits the societal impact, it should still have an equitable or socially just outcome. That will then in turn, as you see with the down arrows, start to change the society in which we are brought up in, socialized and conditioned, so that it can start to change and have a sort of different foundation for change going down the line. So long story short, to limit and address bias, active and ongoing work will need to be done. Implicit bias is set in several contexts, as you see, but we will need to move upward from individual to societal, and the work has to start with us. Individual interpersonal work is imperative, and it will take, it will need to replicate out into the institutional and structural space to be effective for equity work, which will take a lot of practice, dedication, and collective work. So at the front, implicit bias, equity, even to a certain extent, disability justice, racialized ableism is important right now because of the sociology of knowledge, which means that as a society, we have come to this sort of space, whether it's long-term and sustainable or it's fleeting. We've come to this space where we recognize this is an important topic. But we also have to recognize not only is this one product or tool in a larger scheme, but that now that sort of the door has been opened, we need to make sure the door remains open. We knock down the walls. We start to not just continue this work, but really get elbow deeper or more in this work. And that there's more work to be done. So implicit bias we must see as a symptom of larger structured issues, the traditions, the policies, the systems, the histories, all make up the context and setting of bias. And implicit bias is something that has already happening and requires active intervention. It is building a new way of understanding and consistently being proactive, fluid, and adaptive to the vitality or the constantly changing dynamics of the social, cultural, and political space. It's really important to add this understanding to your toolkit as a way to more critically examine situations, contexts, and interactions that may not be equitable. When you think about perhaps a strategic plan for equitable change, whether it's your strategic plan when you're organizing yourself, if it's a movement you're going to start, if it's a job that you may have or a leadership position that you may have, is important again for those change recommendations. We talked about the transactional change, reforming or eliminating a single barrier within a structure to help move certain groups towards a universal goal, or those transformative changes and the fundamental change, which is a fundamental change in structures and systems that shape group outcomes and addresses root causes and not just effects. It also is possible to use the practices that we talked about today as metrics for having those equity outcomes at the societal and all the other 4 levels. One of them is that you can use the 10 principles of disability justice as a metric and have the leadership of those most impacted as assessors or oversight of the initiative or the project. To have intersectional lived experience prioritized and who is leading or amplified in the project. And leadership in communities being compensated equitably, not equally, meaning that you should consider the ways in which people are under-resourced or exploited and compensate in an equitable way. You can also use the metric of equity and social justice that we talked about earlier. You can do this by facilitating through various tools and approaches, consulting, training, civic education, and commitment to change, and asking folks to think about ways in which their impact can fractal out, which is also concurrently asking folks to do some of that work of their own change. And also to see how you can have equity and social justice through your work as a litmus for the societal outcomes within public administration are required for public service and overseen by those mentioned above. On the right, there's a picture of the great Angela Davis with the famous quote, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. And what's important about this is that one of the biggest barriers to finding equity and disability justice, especially racialized ableism, is this idea of siloing the experiences. Not just my experience, but it's an ongoing sort of frustration of, say, you walk into a space and someone's like, we're gonna, like in my case, we're gonna talk about the prioritization of care for disabled folks in hospitals. And I'm like, yeah, and the disproportionate impact on BIPOC too. And I'm like, oh no, we're talking about deprioritization of disabled folks in the hospital. We think it's important to talk about race. Right now we're talking about disability. Perhaps we could bring in race in a different way, or perhaps we could take this up with a racial justice organization and talk about how, you know, from a racial justice perspective, how disabled people, Black, Indigenous people of color are deprioritized. So then I'll take my little happy butt over to a racial justice organization and I'll say, Black, Indigenous people of color who are disabled, or disabled Black, Indigenous people of color being deprioritized care. And I'm like, oh, well, we were talking about the impacts, the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on Black, Indigenous people of color, but we didn't really focus on disability. And to be honest, I don't know if we have the resources to include that lens, but we think it's important. We really think it's important. We think that you should continue with it. Perhaps we can connect you to a disability justice or disability rights org that will be open to this. And often it's the same disability rights org this came from. So it is important to, I would say this, if you have committed to being an active anti-racist, you cannot be an anti-racist if you don't have an intersectional lens. And one of those intersections must be disability justice, because Black, Indigenous people of color are disabled, and there are a lot of disabled people or Black, Indigenous people of color, and you cannot extricate it or ask folks to sort of not bring a part of themselves into a conversation or into a plan for strategic change, especially if the concern is that it would be too complicated to understand. And finally, we talked about transformative practice. And so the first thing, this is sort of the transformative justice guiding principles, but to sort of talk a little bit about this, it's first you would see what are the themes across the narratives of what has happened. Usually in a conflict or when harm is done, especially systemic or historical harm, there's are themes across the narratives that you can consider. And then think about who has been hurt and what are their needs and what have they said their needs are. So in this case, not what you think the person who's hurt's needs are, but from their own mouth, what have they said their needs are? Who is obliged to address these needs? And it may not always be the person who has caused harm. It could be people who support that person or in solidarity with that person or has provided that person with the platform, the power, and the resources. This could be as simple as, say, who's obliged to address these needs? The HR department. or the department manager for this person if it's in the work environment, or a provost if you're in a university setting, or a professor, or someone who is a witness. Who has a stake in the situation, and what is the process to involve them in making things right and preventing future occurrences? It often just happens on the interpersonal institutional level, but this example of this is, let's say, there's an issue of racialized ableism that has happened in your organization. And this person also holds an identity of, say, being non-binary. It is important to not only perhaps bring in, if it is okay with the person who's experienced harm, or if it has since moved from, say, a conflict resolution space to a proactive sort of policy or culture shift conversation space, to bring in folks who are Black, Indigenous people of color, to bring in folks who are disabled, especially people who share the disability community of the person who was harmed, and people who are LGBTQIA plus or marginalized gender, because that was also part of it, and they may have a stake in the situation and may need to be involved in a process to start to think about solutions to ensure that this is not only going to have resolution or repair, but that there are proactive strategies and solutions for preventing future occurrences that is coming from that nuanced understanding of wisdom. Thinking about the reasoning backwards part, the social, political, historical, systemic, cultural, psychological circumstances that led to this, to promote this harm happening. What are those things? Name them out and why. Where did they come from? How are they promoting this harm? Thinking about structural similarities that exist between the situation that you're in and then sort of the result, and sort of when you're reasoning backwards, what are others like it, and what can you learn from that in your strategy building? And finally, coming together to create a variety of strategies based on the different sort of spaces people are in, so that everyone has sort of measures and a pathway towards a shared equity goal, and also can be proactive in preventing future occurrences. So, to continue education, I will be sending you a sort of resource list of some things around racialized ableism. They'll have some articles in there. If you look for articles on your own, focus on narratives or research from trusted sources. If you look for books, there is so many lists right now and filters for different reviewed and vetted pieces, but in this resource list, there'll also be books. I challenge you to follow 50, up to as close to 50 as you can, people who are thought leaders on the topic of racialized ableism. I will provide a list and resource list too. Or any subject or lived experience you're unfamiliar with, is sort of listen or read, and don't respond for 6 months. 2 months if you can't handle it, but try for 6 months. What that will do is it'll show, not just help to provide context for the lived experience of this. There'll be calls to action, because they'll be talking about current events. There will be discourse in those comments where people will resonate with them and to see the themes across those narratives. There will be people who disagree, and what is that discourse? If someone says something that is, instead of considered discourse but considered offensive, how do they address that, and how can you apply that in your own growth and development as someone in solidarity with disabled folks? Ask if you're going to ask for clarity or a lived experience story. Let's ask respectfully or consensually is another way I will put that too, and always reciprocate the labor. My trick for asking consensually is I ask it 3 times. So first I'll say, hey, can I ask you an awkward question? I'll say yeah or no. And so they say yes. I'll say, can I ask you an awkward question about like the subject in general? So like, can I ask you a question about racialized ableism? So they'll say yeah, if they say yeah. So then the final one would be asking about the specific topic area. I just watched this training today, and I have some questions about like racialized ableism and the disproportionate impacts of Black folks in policing. And I know it's a really difficult topic, but are you are you open to this? Do you have the labor for this? And if they say yes, cool, then you can ask all the questions and all the context. If they say no, please respect that. And when I mean consensually, don't, make sure you are asking these consents and not just be like, oh my gosh, I just watched this training and I need you to watch it and I need you to tell me all these things. And I have this question because I was watching this, I had this question about this thing and I was thinking about it and this person said this thing. And you go into that, it doesn't really give a person a chance to say, hey, I might not necessarily be in a space to be able to hold this right now and reciprocate the labor. Especially now we're in a space of collective mutual aid. We should know that it doesn't necessarily have to be financial. But to reciprocate that, whether that is, and sometimes it's just asking is enough. But if they say, whatever that labor looks like, to at least ask. And then finally, praxis. So learn from your mistakes, reflect, lean into this uncomfortable, grow as a seed in the ground. So my grandma used to talk about how growth is really painful and violent. And she would say, we look at seeds and then we look at the products of seeds, these plants with this sort of flowering or fruit. But we don't think about the fact that we have to take the seed, we put it in the ground, and while it's in the ground, it has to destroy itself. It has to break apart. And from its sort of breaking apart, its deconstruction, out of it not only grows roots into the soil and the ground, but also it grows upward towards the sun and it grows outward to flower or fruit. So a couple of things are important about that. Make sure that you are aware of the ground in which you are rooting and planting your seed, because you will then have socialization or conditioning. You will have products of that soil or ground sort of always being infused or coming into your work. So it is really important to make sure that your soil or your ground is conducive for the sort of growth that you would like to do. And also to continue to reach towards the sun and to grow in sort of that way and start to flower and bear that fruit. And that's a practice of cultivation and sustainability that we all are practicing for the rest of our lives. So final takeaways, this is gonna be a lifelong practice. And there's nothing else that I say. This is not a marathon or sprint or relay race. To say it's a marathon or a sprint is to say that we're going to actually pass a finish line in our lifetime, and we're not. This is an issue that is multi-generational and it will remain multi-generational. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And so in saying this is a marathon as opposed to a relay, we have to hold that we have been passed a baton by people who've done this work before us, either as elders or as ancestors. But we also have to hold that we can pass checkpoints or benchmarks in this lifetime, but we will not cross a finish line. We will not achieve the complete dismantling of inequity, in the next 40 to 60 years or 40 to 80 years, depending on our luck and our genes and longevity. So be prepared to when you're passing those checkpoints, how many checkpoints can you pass, so that when you do, it is time for you to pass the baton, that you're passing the baton with a hefty amount of work done for the next generation. And to have a 7, if not 3 generation mindset. So everything that you're doing, how is this going to impact not just at the societal level, but 3 or 7 generations down the line? I always say this workshop may not have planted that seed. It may not have cultivated a seed that has already been planted. I may have just given you a seed. I may have just told you where to buy seeds when you're ready, but wherever you are, please move that process of seed procurement and planting and cultivation to the next step. Life in society is ever changing. It is fluid. It is volatile. It is important to see that. It will really, really help if you see life in society like running water, as opposed to seeing it like a stone or statue. It will really help in sort of finding some innovative solutions for change. Everything takes practice. Some of the data says it takes about 40 times. So if you're doing this daily in creating a new behavior, then great, you have about a month and a half left. Doing this every week, then you have about a year left. You're doing this more than every week. You got some time. And going back to the last piece, since life in society is ever changing, we all will have to come back to relearning, retraining, reconditioning, resocializing ourselves into the next thing. One of the things that we saw happen in sort of quick turnaround was first asking people what their preferred pronouns are. And now we're in a space where it's not about asking people what their preferred pronouns, it's asking them their pronouns, not that they're preferred. That doesn't mean that everyone who asked for preferred pronouns before were necessarily doing anything inequitable, but those who continue to do it, knowing that our society is ever changing and fluid and adaptive, might be doing some harm and being inequitable. So it's important that when these things happen, and if you don't get it right the first few times, to not fret. It takes about 40 times for something to become like a habit or muscle memory. Again, remember, humans are fallible. To err is human, but to use another adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So have that impact over intent instead of an intent versus impact mindset. And finally, reason backwards. Work towards adaptive intuition, not reactive performance. I look forward to hearing your questions and debriefing next week. If you want to reach out to me before we have that, please contact me. You can find me at ChrisTianaObeySumner.com, or you can put ChrisTiana ObeySumner, put at Gmail at the end, and you can email me. That would be all one word. You can put my name into LinkedIn and connect with me on there. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Clippings, or Google. So it was great. I appreciate you spending this time with me, and I look forward to spending more time with y'all next week.